I'm Marcus Rivera, 42, and for the past 8 years, I've been the private investigator billionaires call when they need their deepest secrets buried or unearthed. Last month, tech mogul Harrison Blackwood hired me to investigate his own family something about protecting the legacy before his death. What I discovered in their estate's hidden basement wasn't just evidence of crimes spanning 3 generations, but a systematic cover-up of horrors that would make headlines for decades. The Blackwood fortune, built on something so dark that even I, someone who's seen the worst of humanity, couldn't sleep for weeks. And now, with Harrison dead and his will reading tomorrow, I'm the only one who knows the truth that will either destroy his empire or damn his heirs forever. Hit like if you think some family secrets should stay buried, and subscribe because what I'm about to tell you will change how you see the ultra-wealthy forever. 3 weeks ago, my phone rang at 2:47 a.m. in my line of work. Middle of the night calls usually mean someone's dead. Someone's about to be dead, or someone's discovered something that makes them wish they were dead. The voice on the other end was shaky, older, refined, the kind of voice that's used to commanding boardrooms, but now sounded like it belonged to a frightened child. "Mr. Rivera, this is Harrison Blackwood. I need your help." I knew the name, of course, everyone did. Harrison Blackwood had built Blackwood Industries from a small electronics company into a tech empire worth $37 billion. His face graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune regularly. But the man on my phone didn't sound like a tech mogul. He sounded terrified. "What can I do for you, Mr. Blackwood?" "I need you to investigate my family." The words came out in a rush, like he was afraid he'd lose his nerve if he spoke too slowly. "My children, specifically." "Something's wrong, Mr. Rivera. Something's been wrong for years, and I'm finally ready to face it." I'd handled plenty of family drama for the ultra-wealthy cheating spouses, drug-addicted heirs, embezzlement schemes. But something about Harrison's tone made my skin crawl. This wasn't about money or infidelity. This was deeper. "Can you be more specific about what concerns you? Not over the phone." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Meet me tomorrow at my estate." "Come alone." "And Mr. Rivera, whatever you find, whatever I ask you to do, I'll make it worth your while." The next morning, I drove through the gates of the Blackwood estate in Atherton, California. The property sprawled across 47 acres of prime Silicon Valley real estate, worth more than most small countries' GDP. The main house was a modernist masterpiece of glass and steel, old clean lines and expensive angles. But as I walked up the marble steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from behind those pristine windows. Harrison met me at the door himself. No butler, no security, just a 73-year-old billionaire with haunted eyes and trembling hands. He was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 5'8" in expensive Italian shoes, with silver hair that looked like he'd been running his fingers through it obsessively. "Thank you for coming," he said, ushering me into a study lined with first-edition books and original Picassos. "Can I offer you coffee? Water?" "I'm fine." "Why didn't you tell me what's troubling you?" He walked to his desk and picked up a handwritten letter, unusual in a world where everything was digital. The paper was expensive, heavy stock, but I could see his hands shaking as he held it. "I wrote this 3 days ago," he said, handing it to me. "I've been trying to find the courage to hire someone like you for months, but I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that I was just a paranoid old man seeing monsters in shadows." The letter was written in elegant cursive, but the handwriting was unsteady, like someone had been writing during an earthquake. It began, "If something happens to me before I can make this right, know that I tried. The sins of the fathers have been visited upon the children, and now the children have made those sins their own. God help me, I was complicit for too long. Mr. Blackwood, what exactly do you think your children have done?" He sat down heavily in his leather chair, suddenly looking every one of his 73 years. "That's what I need you to find out. I've suspected for years, but I've been too much of a coward to face the truth. The way they look at me sometimes, like they're calculating something. The conversations that stop when I enter a room. The financial discrepancies I've been finding in our subsidiary accounts." "What kind of discrepancies?" "Money flowing to organizations that don't seem to exist. payments to medical facilities that aren't listed in any directories, private flights to locations that make no sense for our business. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. Mr. Rivera, I built this company to leave something good in the world, but I'm afraid my children have turned it into something monstrous. I'd seen plenty of family dysfunction, but the fear in Harrison's eyes was something different. This wasn't about sibling rivalry or corporate power struggles. This was about a father who was genuinely terrified of his own children. I'll take the case, I told him. But I need complete access, financial records, employee files, property deeds, everything. Done. He pulled out his phone and began typing. I'm transferring $5 million to your account right now. Cryptocurrency. Untraceable. There's more where that came from if you can prove what I suspect. $5 million for investigating his own family. Whatever Harrison Blackwood suspected his children of doing, it was big enough to make a billionaire desperate and generous. As I left the estate that day, I noticed security cameras hidden throughout the property, more than any residential compound would need. I also noticed that several of them were pointed inward, toward the house itself, as if the real threats were expected to come from inside. Before diving into any family investigation, I always start with the public record. What the world knows about a family often tells you more about what they're hiding than what they're showing. The Blackwood story, according to Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, was a classic American dream narrative, but the more I dug, the more the timeline didn't add up. The official story began with Edmund Blackwood, Harrison's grandfather, who supposedly started a small electronics repair shop in Palo Alto in 1952. Within 5 years, he'd somehow transformed that modest business into Blackwood Electronics, landing major government contracts for military communications equipment. By 1965, the company was worth $50 million, an astronomical sum for that era, especially for someone who'd allegedly started with nothing. But here's where it got interesting. I pulled Edmund's immigration records from the National Archives, and according to the paperwork, he'd arrived in the United States in 1947 from Germany with no money, no English, and no technical background. Yet somehow, within 5 years, he was not only fluent in English but had become an expert in cutting-edge electronics, technology that was barely understood even by MIT graduates. The incorporation papers for Blackwood Electronics, filed in 1952, showed something even more suspicious. Edmund wasn't the sole founder. There were 3 silent partners listed, but their names had been redacted from every copy I could find. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase these people from the company's history. In my experience, when people work that hard to hide something, it's usually because that something could destroy them. I traced Edmund's early government contracts and found they were all related to Project MKUltra and other classified psychological research programs. Blackwood Electronics had supplied specialized recording equipment, monitoring devices, and what the contracts vaguely described as behavioral modification apparatus to facilities across the country. These weren't your typical military radios. This was equipment designed for human experimentation. Harrison's father, Thomas Blackwood, had taken over the company in 1978 and transformed it from a government contractor into a consumer electronics powerhouse. Under his leadership, Blackwood Industries developed some of the first personal computers, mobile phones, and eventually social media platforms. But even Thomas's success story had holes in it. How does a company go from making experimental psychology equipment to revolutionizing consumer technology? The technical leap was too dramatic, too perfect. When Harrison inherited control in 2003, he pivoted the company again, this time into biotechnology and pharmaceutical research. Blackwood Industries now owned 17 research facilities across 6 countries, all supposedly working on revolutionary treatments for genetic disorders and mental health conditions. But when I tried to find published research from these facilities, I came up empty. For a company that claimed to be on the cutting edge of medical science, they were remarkably quiet about their discoveries. Harrison's 3 children were all involved in the business now. Victoria, 38, ran the biotechnology division. Marcus, yes, we shared a name, which made research confusing, was 35 and handled international operations. The youngest, Elizabeth, was 32 and oversaw what the company called special projects. Their backgrounds were as polished as their fathers and grandfathers, but equally mysterious. All three had attended elite schools, earned advanced degrees in their respective fields, and stepped seamlessly into executive roles at Blackwood Industries. But none of them had ever worked anywhere else. No internships at other companies, no graduate research at universities, no normal career progression. They had gone straight from college into the family business, as if they'd been groomed for specific roles their entire lives. What really caught my attention was the property holdings. In addition to the main estate in Atherton, the Blackwood family owned 17 properties across the United States and Canada. Most were listed as research facilities or corporate retreats, but they were all located in remote areas, far from major cities or universities. Strange locations for cutting-edge research, unless you wanted to make sure no one could hear what was happening inside. I spent 3 days mapping out the family's financial network, following shell companies and offshore accounts. The deeper I dug, the more complicated it became. Money flowed between dozens of entities with innocuous names like Alpine Medical Research and Pacific Wellness Foundation. But when I tried to find these organizations online or in business directories, most of them didn't seem to exist outside of banking records. The pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing. Every few months, large sums would be transferred to accounts associated with adoption agencies, foster care systems, and what appeared to be human trafficking networks. The payments were always structured to avoid federal reporting requirements, split across multiple transactions, and routed through different countries. By the time I finished my initial research, I had a sick feeling in my stomach. The Blackwood fortune wasn't just built on government contracts or consumer electronics. It was built on something much darker, something that required constant feeding with fresh victims and absolute secrecy. And Harrison's children weren't just running a business. They were continuing a family tradition that stretched back 3 generations. The official Blackwood story was a lie. And I was starting to understand why Harrison was so terrified of his own family. Armed with my research, I returned to the Blackwood estate the following week. This time, Harrison had arranged for me to meet his children under the guise of updating the family's security protocols. It would give me a chance to observe them up close while having a legitimate reason to examine the property's surveillance systems. Victoria Blackwood answered the door herself, which immediately struck me as odd. In my experience, billionaire families don't answer their own doors. They have staff for that. But Victoria seemed to prefer control over delegation. She was tall, elegant, with the kind of severe beauty that made you think of ice sculptures. Her handshake was firm, her smile perfect, and her eyes completely dead. "Mr. Rivera, I presume? Father mentioned you'd be conducting a security assessment." Her voice was cultured, professional, but there was something underneath it that made my skin crawl. "I'm Victoria Blackwood, Chief of Biotechnology Operations." She led me through the house, and I noticed that every room we passed had been recently cleaned to an almost surgical degree. The marble floors gleamed, the windows were spotless, and there wasn't a speck of dust anywhere. It felt more like a medical facility than a family home. "Your father mentioned some concerns about the properties." "Vulnerability," I said, pulling out my tablet to take notes. "Has the family experienced any security incidents recently?" "Nothing specific," Victoria replied, but I caught her glance toward a security camera mounted in the corner. "Father tends to worry about things that haven't happened yet. He's been rather paranoid lately." Marcus Blackwood joined us in the main living room, and the family resemblance was striking. Same height as his sister, same sharp features, same unsettling smile. But where Victoria was ice, Marcus was fire, barely contained energy that seemed to vibrate just beneath his expensive suit. "Another security consultant?" Marcus asked, not bothering to hide his irritation. "Father's hired 3 in the past 2 years. What makes you think you'll find something the others missed?" "I specialize in different kinds of threats," I replied carefully. "Sometimes the danger isn't from outside." The brothers exchanged a look that lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it was enough. They were communicating without words, the way people do when they've been keeping secrets together for a long time. Elizabeth was the last to arrive, and she was different from her siblings. Smaller, softer, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was either very anxious or very excited about something. She kept checking her phone and glancing at her watch. "Sorry I'm late," she said, though she didn't sound sorry at all. "I was just finishing up some work in the basement laboratory." Basement laboratory? The words hung in the air like a challenge. I'd seen no mention of a laboratory in any of the property records or building permits. "That sounds fascinating," I said. "What kind of research do you conduct here?" "Oh, just some preliminary work for our biotechnology division," Elizabeth replied. But her hands were shaking slightly. "Nothing too exciting. Dad insisted we have a small facility here for convenience." I asked to see the security system blueprints, and Victoria led me to Harrison's study. The plans were comprehensive motion. Sensors, cameras, pressure plates, the works. But as I studied them, I noticed something strange. The basement level showed significantly more security measures than the rest of the house. Reinforced doors, separate ventilation systems, soundproofing, and what appeared to be an independent power supply. "This is quite elaborate for a small research facility," I commented. "We work with sensitive materials," Marcus said from behind me. I hadn't heard him enter the room. "Biological samples, genetic material." FDA regulations require certain security protocols. The blueprints also showed something else, a network of hidden cameras throughout the house that weren't part of the main security system. These cameras were positioned to monitor the family's private areas, bedrooms, bathrooms, personal offices. Someone was watching the watchers. As I continued my security assessment, I noticed other oddities. The staff was minimal, just a housekeeper and a groundskeeper, both of whom seemed terrified of the family. Most houses this size would have a full team, but the Blackwoods seemed to prefer privacy over convenience. The house itself felt wrong. Despite being a family home, there were no personal photographs on display, no children's artwork, no evidence that this had ever been a place where people lived and loved and grew up together. It was more like a museum or a laboratory, clean, sterile, and completely devoid of warmth. But the most disturbing discovery was the soundproofing. Every room had been extensively soundproofed, far beyond what would be necessary for privacy or noise control. The walls contained multiple layers of acoustic dampening material, the kind used in recording studios or psychiatric facilities. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that whatever happened in this house, no one outside would hear it. By the time I left that evening, I had a clear picture of the family dynamics. Harrison was afraid of his children, and his children were afraid of something else or someone else. They were all keeping secrets, but the children's secrets were bigger and darker than their father's. The security blueprints I'd been given were incomplete. I was certain of it. There were areas of the basement that weren't shown on any of the plans, spaces that existed but weren't officially acknowledged. And those spaces were where the real secrets were hidden. I needed to get back into that house. But next time I wouldn't be coming as a guest. 3 days after my visit to the estate, Harrison called me with news that made my blood run cold. He'd gained access to his father's old files, documents that had been locked away in a safety deposit box for decades. What he'd found there changed everything I thought I knew about the Blackwood family. We met at a small cafe in downtown Palo Alto, far from the estate and its watching eyes. Harrison looked like he'd aged 10 years since our last meeting. His hands shook as he slid a manila folder across the table to me. "These are medical records," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "From 1960 to 1987, my father kept meticulous documentation of everything." I opened the folder and immediately wished I hadn't. Inside were dozens of death certificates for children between the ages of 5 and 16. All had died at various Blackwood-owned properties, all from causes listed as genetic abnormalities or developmental complications. But these weren't random deaths. They were documented with clinical precision, as if someone had been studying them. "Jesus Christ, Harrison, how many?" 43 that I found so far. His coffee sat untouched, growing cold. "All children who had been adopted through agencies connected to our family foundation." They would come to live with us, supposedly for specialized medical care due to their conditions, and then they would die. The death certificates were signed by Dr. Werner Hoffman, a name I didn't recognize but would remember. Each certificate was accompanied by adoption papers, showing that these children had been legally transferred to the care of the Blackwood family just months or sometimes weeks before their deaths, but the most disturbing documents were the medical files themselves. Detailed records of procedures performed on these children, experimental surgeries, drug trials, psychological conditioning programs. These weren't attempts to help sick children. These were deliberate experiments designed to test the limits of human endurance and modification. My father called it developmental research, Harrison continued, staring out the cafe window. He convinced himself he was advancing medical science, helping future generations, but I can see now what it really was. One file caught my attention, a boy named Timothy Chun, age 8. Adopted in 1973, his medical record showed a progression of procedures that read like a torture: manual surgical implants in his brain, injection of experimental compounds, exposure to extreme temperatures, and sensory deprivation. The final entry, dated 6 months later, simply read, "Subject expired during neural pathway modification. Tissue samples preserved for analysis." "There are more recent records, too," Harrison said, pulling out a second folder. "From the 1990s and early 2000s, after my father died and I took over the company, I thought this had all stopped. I was naive. The newer files showed that the practices had not only continued but had become more sophisticated. The children were no longer dying from the experiments, they were surviving them, but what they became afterward was unclear. The medical terminology was more advanced, the procedures more precise, but the fundamental horror remained the same." "Your children know about this?" I asked. "They're the ones running it now." Harrison's voice cracked. "Victoria oversees the medical aspects, Marcus handles acquisition and transport, and Elizabeth manages the facilities. They've turned my family's sickness into a multinational operation." The adoption record showed a disturbing pattern. Children were being acquired through a network of agencies across multiple countries: Romania, Cambodia, Ukraine, Mexico. All places where poor families might be desperate enough to give up their children for what appeared to be medical care and a better life in America. "How long have you known?" "I started suspecting 2 years ago when I noticed irregularities in our foundation's spending, but I didn't want to believe it." Harrison finally looked at me, and I saw the weight of decades of willful ignorance in his eyes. I told myself they were just continuing our legitimate medical research, that maybe they'd found ways to help these children instead of— He couldn't finish the sentence. The most recent file was dated just 3 months ago. A girl named Maria Santos, age 12, from an orphanage in Guatemala. According to her adoption papers, she suffered from a rare genetic condition that required specialized treatment only available through the Blackwood Medical Foundation. But her medical file told a different story. She was healthy when she arrived, and the treatment she received was designed to induce the very condition the foundation claimed to be treating. "Where is she now?" I asked. "I don't know. None of the recent subjects appear in our official records after their initial processing. They just disappear." As I studied the documents, I realized this wasn't just about individual crimes against children. This was a systematic program of human experimentation that had been running for over 60 years. 3 generations of Blackwoods had participated in or overseen what could only be described as genocide. "Harrison, we need to contact the FBI. This is evidence of crimes against humanity. They'll destroy everything the moment they suspect I've talked," he said. "And those children who are still alive, if any of them are still alive, they'll disappear forever. I need you to find out where they're keeping the current subjects first. Then we can bring in law enforcement." Looking at those death certificates, at the clinical documentation of unspeakable horrors, I understood why Harrison had been too terrified to sleep. His family hadn't just hidden their crimes, they'd perfected them. And somewhere, right now, more children were suffering because I wasn't moving fast enough to stop it. That night, I made the decision that would either solve this case or get me killed. I was going back to the Blackwood estate, and this time I was getting into that basement laboratory. Harrison had given me the security codes during our cafe meeting, along with a warning that his children had installed additional measures he didn't know about. I waited until 3 a.m. before making my move. The estate was dark except for a few security lights along the perimeter. I'd studied the patrol patterns of the guards during my previous visits. They made rounds every 2 hours, spending most of their time monitoring the gates rather than the house itself. The family's arrogance worked in my favor. They never expected anyone to be bold enough to break into their home. The side entrance Harrison had told me about was exactly where he'd said it would be, hidden behind a decorative screen near the pool house. His keycard worked on the first try, and I slipped inside without triggering any alarms. The house felt different at night, more oppressive. As if the darkness revealed its true nature, I made my way through the corridors I'd memorized, heading toward the basement access. But as I approached the stairwell, I heard something that made me freeze, the sound of machinery running below, and what might have been voices. Someone was down there. The basement door required a different code, one Harrison hadn't been able to give me, but the lock was older than the rest of the security system, probably installed during the original construction. I'd come prepared with electronic lockpicks, and after 10 minutes of careful work, I heard the satisfying click of the mechanism disengaging. The stairwell was sterile white, lined with the same soundproofing material I'd noticed throughout the house. But here it was thicker, more extensive. Whatever happened down here, the Blackwoods wanted to make absolutely certain no sound escaped. The basement was larger than the house blueprints had indicated, extending far beyond the foundation's footprint. It was clearly a professional medical facility, complete with examination rooms, surgical suites, and what appeared to be recovery wards. But this wasn't designed for healing. Every piece of equipment I recognized was intended for restraint, monitoring, or inflicting controlled trauma. In the first room I entered, I found them stainless steel examination tables equipped with leather restraints, IV stands loaded with unmarked medication, and monitoring equipment that tracked every biological function imaginable. The walls were lined with cameras, some obviously for security, others positioned to record procedures from multiple angles. The laboratory equipment bore serial numbers that I photographed with my phone. Later research would reveal that most of it had been purchased through government surplus auctions equipment, originally designed for military medical research and psychological warfare programs. Some pieces were so specialized that only a handful existed in the world, but it was the recovery area that truly revealed the scope of their operation. 12 hospital beds, each equipped with full life support systems and heavy restraints. Half of them showed signs of recent use: rumpled sheets, medical waste in the nearby bins, and the unmistakable smell of antiseptic mixed with human suffering. I found the files in a locked cabinet that took me another 15 minutes to crack. Inside were current medical records for 8 children, ages 7 to 15, all listed as active subjects. Their photographs showed hollow eyes and the kind of malnutrition that comes from prolonged medical trauma. These weren't sick children being treated, they were healthy children being systematically destroyed. The most recent entries were dated just 2 days ago. A boy named David Kim, age 10, had undergone what the records called cognitive restructuring therapy, a procedure that involves surgical insertion of electrodes into specific brain regions, followed by weeks of electrical stimulation designed to alter personality and memory. The clinical notes described his progress, with the detachment of someone documenting a chemistry experiment. Another file belonged to Sarah Mitchell, age 13, who had been subjected to what they called enhanced interrogation conditioning. The procedures were designed to break down her psychological defenses and rebuild her personality according to predetermined parameters. The goal, according to the notes, was to create subjects who would be completely compliant and unable to remember their previous lives. As I photographed the files, I heard footsteps on the stairs above. Someone was coming down? I quickly closed the cabinet and looked for another exit, but the basement had only one way in or out. I was trapped. The footsteps belonged to Elizabeth Blackwood. She appeared at the bottom of the stairs wearing surgical scrubs, carrying a medical bag that suggested she'd been planning to work on one of the subjects. When she saw me, her reaction wasn't surprise or anger, it was disappointment, like a parent catching a child in a predictable lie. "Mr. Rivera," she said calmly, setting down her bag, "I wondered when you'd find your way down here. Father really shouldn't have given you those access codes. Where are the children, Elizabeth? They're safe, sleeping peacefully under sedation. We've found that the procedures are less traumatic when subjects aren't conscious for the preliminary stages." She spoke about torture with the casual tone someone might use to discuss gardening. "These children have families. People are looking for them." Elizabeth laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "No one is looking for them, Mr. Rivera. We're very careful about acquisition. These children come from situations where their disappearance will be attributed to the usual tragedies: runaways, trafficking, family violence. We actually provide a better life than most of them would have had." The clinical detachment in her voice was more terrifying than any threat could have been. She genuinely believed she was helping these children, even as she destroyed them. That level of self-deception suggested a pathology that ran much deeper than simple cruelty. "Your father hired me to stop this. Our father is a sentimental old man who's lost his nerve," she replied. "But don't worry about him. We've been planning his retirement for some time now." And that's when I realized Harrison was in immediate danger. His children weren't just continuing the family tradition. They were preparing to eliminate the one person who could expose them. That night, I made the decision that would either solve this case or get me killed. I was going back to the Blackwood estate, and this time I was getting into that basement laboratory. Harrison had given me the security codes during our cafe meeting, along with a warning that his children had installed additional measures he didn't know about. I waited until 3 a.m. before making my move. The estate was dark except for a few security lights along the perimeter. I'd studied the patrol patterns of the guards during my previous visits. They made rounds every 2 hours, spending most of their time monitoring the gates rather than the house itself. The family's arrogance worked in my favor. They never expected anyone to be bold enough to break into their home. The side entrance Harrison had told me about was exactly where he'd said it would be, hidden behind a decorative screen near the pool house. His keycard worked on the first try, and I slipped inside without triggering any alarms. The house felt different at night, more oppressive. As if the darkness revealed its true nature, I made my way through the corridors I'd memorized, heading toward the basement access. But as I approached the stairwell, I heard something that made me freeze. The sound of machinery running below, and what might have been voices. Someone was down there. The basement door required a different code, one Harrison hadn't been able to give me, but the lock was older than the rest of the security system, probably installed during the original construction. I'd come prepared with electronic lockpicks, and after 10 minutes of careful work, I heard the satisfying click of the mechanism disengaging. The stairwell was sterile white, lined with the same soundproofing material I'd noticed throughout the house. But here it was thicker, more extensive. Whatever happened down here, the Blackwoods wanted to make absolutely certain no sound escaped. The basement was larger than the house blueprints had indicated, extending far beyond the foundation's footprint. It was clearly a professional medical facility, complete with examination rooms, surgical suites, and what appeared to be recovery wards. But this wasn't designed for healing. Every piece of equipment I recognized was intended for restraint, monitoring, or inflicting controlled trauma. In the first room I entered, I found them: stainless steel examination tables equipped with leather, restraints, IV stands loaded with unmarked medication, and monitoring equipment that tracked every biological function imaginable. The walls were lined with cameras, some obviously for security, others positioned to record procedures from multiple angles. The laboratory equipment bore serial numbers that I photographed with my phone. Later research would reveal that most of it had been purchased through government surplus auctions equipment, originally designed for military medical research and psychological warfare programs. Some pieces were so specialized that only a handful existed in the world, but it was the recovery area that truly revealed the scope of their operation. 12 hospital beds, each equipped with full life support systems and heavy restraints. Half of them showed signs of recent use, rumpled sheets, medical waste in the nearby bins, and the unmistakable smell of antiseptic mixed with human suffering. I found the files in a locked cabinet that took me another 15 minutes to crack. Inside were current medical records for 8 children, ages 7 to 15, all listed as active subjects. Their photographs showed hollow eyes and the kind of malnutrition that comes from prolonged medical trauma. These weren't sick children being treated, they were healthy children being systematically destroyed. The most recent entries were dated. Just 2 days ago, a boy named David Kim, age 10, had undergone what the records called cognitive restructuring therapy, a procedure that involves surgical insertion of electrodes into specific brain regions, followed by weeks of electrical stimulation designed to alter personality and memory. The clinical notes described his progress with the detachment of someone documenting a chemistry experiment. Another file belonged to Sarah Mitchell, age 13, who had been subjected to what they called enhanced interrogation conditioning. The procedures were designed to break down her psychological defenses and rebuild her personality according to predetermined parameters. The goal, according to the notes, was to create subjects who would be completely compliant and unable to remember their previous lives. As I photographed the files, I heard footsteps on the stairs above. Someone was coming down? I quickly closed the cabinet and looked for another exit, but the basement had only one way in or out. I was trapped. The footsteps belonged to Elizabeth Blackwood. She appeared at the bottom of the stairs wearing surgical scrubs, carrying a medical bag that suggested she'd been planning to work on one of the subjects. When she saw me, her reaction wasn't surprise or anger, it was disappointment, like a parent catching a child in a predictable lie. "Mr. Rivera," she said calmly, setting down her bag. "I wondered when you'd find your way down here. Father really shouldn't have given you those access codes. Where are the children, Elizabeth? They're safe, sleeping peacefully under sedation. We found that the procedures are less traumatic when subjects aren't conscious for the preliminary stages." She spoke about torture with the casual tone someone might use to discuss gardening. "These children have families. People are looking for them." Elizabeth laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "No one is looking for them, Mr. Rivera. We're very careful about acquisition. These children come from situations where their disappearance will be attributed to the usual tragedies: runaways, trafficking, family violence. We actually provide a better life than most of them would have had." The clinical detachment in her voice was more terrifying than any threat could have been. She genuinely believed she was helping these children, even as she destroyed them. That level of self-deception suggested a pathology that ran much deeper than simple cruelty. "Your father hired me to stop this." "Our father is a sentimental old man who's lost his nerve," she replied. "But don't worry about him. We've been planning his retirement for some time now." And that's when I realized Harrison was in immediate danger. His children weren't just continuing the family tradition. They were preparing to eliminate the one person who could expose them. Elizabeth's casual mention of her father's retirement sent ice through my veins, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to get out of that basement alive, and more importantly, I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. The equipment I'd seen suggested this operation was far more sophisticated than a family of psychopaths conducting freelance experiments. "You're very calm for someone who just discovered they're trapped with a murderer," Elizabeth observed, tilting her head like a curious bird. "Most people would be screaming by now." "Most people haven't seen what I've seen," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I have to admit, this is more extensive than I expected. Your grandfather must have been quite the visionary." Elizabeth's eyes lit up with genuine pride. Grandfather Edmund was ahead of his time. He understood that human evolution needed guidance, that natural selection was too slow and random for modern society. What we do here isn't cruelty, it's advancement. She moved toward a filing cabinet I hadn't yet examined and pulled out a thick folder. Inside were documents that made my blood freeze, immigration papers for Edmund Blackwood, but not the ones I'd seen in the National Archives. These showed his real name, Dr. Edmund Kleist, formerly of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity and Eugenics. Your grandfather was a Nazi, I said. He was a scientist, Elizabeth corrected. The political circumstances of his early career were irrelevant. What mattered was his research. When the Americans brought him here through Operation Paperclip, they understood the value of his work. The documents revealed the truth about Edmund's mysterious rise to power. He hadn't been just any Nazi scientist, he'd been one of Joseph Mengele's protégés specializing in genetic modification and psychological conditioning. The U.S. government had given him a new identity, unlimited funding, and complete immunity in exchange for continuing his research under American supervision. The early subjects you found records of upstairs, Elizabeth continued. Those were provided by the CIA as part of MKUltra. Grandfather's work was instrumental in developing enhanced interrogation techniques and psychological warfare capabilities. Every breakthrough he made in understanding human limits and modification was shared with our government partners. She pulled out photographs from the 1950s and 1960s showing Edmund working alongside men in military uniforms and government suits. In the background of several photos, I could see children in hospital gowns, their faces blank and lifeless. But grandfather wasn't content to just serve others' agendas, Elizabeth said. He began documenting everything, keeping copies of all research and subject files. By the time the government programs were officially discontinued, he had accumulated enough evidence to ensure his family's protection and continued funding. Blackmail, I said. Insurance, she corrected. Grandfather understood that his work was too important to be subject to political whims, so he made certain that powerful people had a vested interest in protecting the Blackwood legacy. The files showed a network of complicity that stretched across decades and administrations. Senators, Supreme Court justices, CIA directors, military officials all had participated in or profited from Edmund's research. All had their careers and reputations tied to maintaining the family's secrets. When Father took over the company, Elizabeth continued, he initially tried to distance us from Grandfather's work. He thought he could transform the business into something legitimate. But he discovered that our government partners weren't interested in letting us retire from the family business. She showed me financial records from the 1980s and 1990s revealing ongoing payments from various government agencies and private military contractors. The Blackwood family wasn't just continuing their research out of personal interest. They were being paid to maintain capabilities that officially didn't exist. The children you've been experimenting on, they're not just random victims. Of course not, Elizabeth said, as if I'd suggested something absurd. Every subject is carefully selected based on specific genetic markers and psychological profiles. We're not monsters, Mr. Rivera, we're researchers. Each subject contributes to advancing human understanding and capability. The clinical files she showed me next revealed the true scope of their current operation. They weren't just torturing children, they were attempting to create what they called enhanced humans, subjects who could withstand extreme physical trauma, resist psychological manipulation, and perform beyond normal human limits. Some of our graduates have gone on to very successful careers, Elizabeth said with obvious pride. Military special operations, intelligence services, private security. They may not remember their time with us, but they carry our improvements with them. Graduates? Subjects who successfully complete the full conditioning program. We've had a 93% success rate over the past decade. Much better than Grandfather's early experiments. The implication hit me like a physical blow. They weren't killing all the children, they were turning some of them into programmed weapons and releasing them into society. People in positions of power and authority, who had been psychologically conditioned to serve the Blackwood agenda without even knowing it. How many? I asked. 237 since 1995, Elizabeth replied matter-of-factly. They're placed in strategic positions across government, military, and corporate sectors. Think of them as our insurance policy for the next generation. Looking at Edmund's Nazi documentation, I finally understood why Harrison had been so terrified. His family hadn't just inherited a business, they'd inherited a machine for creating monsters. And that machine had been running continuously for Over 70 years, protected by the very institutions that were supposed to prevent such horrors. Elizabeth's revelation about their graduates was horrifying enough. But what she showed me next made me understand that the Blackwood operation wasn't just a relic from the past, it was actively expanding. She led me to a computer terminal and entered a series of passwords that granted access to what she called the current inventory system. The screen displayed a database that looked like something from a human trafficking operation, because that's exactly what it was. Hundreds of profiles of children from around the world, complete with photographs, medical histories, psychological assessments, and acquisition timelines. But this wasn't random kidnapping. This was systematic procurement based on specific criteria. We maintain active relationships with adoption agencies, foster care systems, and orphanages in 43 countries. Elizabeth explained, scrolling through the database with practiced efficiency. Our talent scouts identify subjects with the genetic markers and psychological profiles we need for different programs. Each child's profile included details that made my stomach turn: resistance to pain, response to authority figures, family, attachment levels, and something called modification potential. They were shopping for children the way normal people shop for cars, looking for specific features and capabilities. The beauty of our current system, Elizabeth continued, is that everything appears completely legitimate. We operate through established charitable foundations, medical research grants, and international aid programs. Parents think they're giving their children opportunities for better medical care or education in America. She pulled up the file. For Maria Santos, the 12-year-old girl Harrison had mentioned. Her profile showed that she'd been selected not because of any medical condition, but because psychological testing had identified her as having exceptional resistance to trauma and high adaptation capacity. In other words, she could survive their experiments better than most children. Where is Maria now? I asked. Completing Phase 3 conditioning, Elizabeth replied, clicking to another screen that showed a live video feed. I found myself looking at a sterile white room where a small figure lay motionless on a hospital bed. Surrounded by monitoring equipment and 4 drips, the girl in the bed was barely recognizable as human. Her head had been shaved and was covered with surgical scars. Electrodes protruded from various points on her skull, connected to a machine that displayed brainwave patterns. Her eyes were open but completely vacant, staring at nothing. Phase 3 involves neurological restructuring, Elizabeth explained with the enthusiasm of someone discussing a hobby. We're mapping her brain's response patterns and gradually modifying her neural pathways to optimize obedience and pain tolerance. The process takes approximately 6 months. Jesus Christ, Elizabeth, she's just a child. She's a subject, Elizabeth corrected firmly. And when her conditioning is complete, she'd be capable of things that normal humans could never achieve. We're giving her abilities that will make her valuable to organizations around the world. The live feed showed 7 other rooms, each containing a child in various stages of what Elizabeth called enhancement. Some were conscious but restrained, staring at screens that flashed rapidly changing images designed to break down their psychological defenses. Others were unconscious, undergoing surgical procedures that I couldn't bear to watch. The current subjects represent our most ambitious program yet, Elizabeth said, clearly proud of their progress. We're not just creating operatives. Anymore, we're developing what we call adaptive humans, subjects who can be programmed for multiple functions and updated as needed. She accessed another file that showed the intended destinations for each child. Military contractors, intelligence agencies, private security firms, even some legitimate corporations that apparently had use for people with enhanced pain tolerance and absolute obedience. The children weren't just being tortured, they were being turned into products for sale. The profit margins are extraordinary, Elizabeth continued. A fully conditioned subject can be sold for anywhere from $5 to $50 million, depending on their capabilities and the client's requirements. We currently have orders backed up for the next 3 years. The database showed financial records that confirmed her claims. The Blackwood family wasn't just continuing their grandfather's research, they'd turned it into a billion-dollar industry. Money flowed from government agencies, military contractors, and private clients around the world, all paying premium prices for what the files euphemistically called human resources. Your father doesn't know about the current scope of the operation, I said. Father knows what he needs to know, Elizabeth replied. He's been useful for maintaining our legitimate business operations and providing cover for our real work, but he's become a liability recently. His conscience has been troubling him. She pulled up one more file that made my blood run cold, a detailed plan for Harrison's elimination. The document, dated just 1 week ago, outlined how they would stage his death to look like a heart attack, complete with forged medical records and a compliant coroner who was apparently one of their early graduates. The will reading is scheduled for tomorrow, Elizabeth said. Father believes he's exposing us, but actually he's giving us the perfect opportunity to tie up loose ends. His death will be attributed to the shock of discovering his children's activities and his will, the real one. Not the fake document he thinks he's hidden leaves everything to us with no outside oversight. Looking at that assassination plan, I realized that Harrison had been right to be terrified. His children weren't just monsters. They were efficient, organized monsters with unlimited resources and government protection, and I was the only person who knew the truth about what they were planning. Why are you telling me all this? I asked. Elizabeth smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. Because, Mr. Rivera, we've been researching you too. Your military background, your psychological profile, your financial situation. We think you'd make an excellent addition to our operation. You want to recruit me? We want to offer you a choice, she said. You can continue investigating us and eventually join your client in an unfortunate accident. Or you can become part of something much larger and more important than anything you've ever done before. She was offering me a chance to join the most sophisticated human trafficking and torture operation in history. And from the confidence in her voice, I could tell she genuinely believed I might accept. Elizabeth's recruitment offer hung in the air between us like a loaded gun. I needed to buy time to get out of that basement alive, and most importantly, to warn Harrison before his children implemented their plan. So I did what any good investigator does. When cornered, I pretended to consider the offer while gathering more intelligence. That's quite a proposition, I said carefully. But I'd need to understand more about what you're offering. What exactly would my role be? Elizabeth's smile widened. She genuinely believed she was winning me over. Someone with your skills and background would be perfect for our acquisition and security operations. We need people who can identify potential subjects, manage international transport, and handle any complications that arise. She led me to another terminal and accessed what she called Harrison's confession files. What I saw there explained why Harrison had been so desperate and terrified when he first contacted me. The screen showed hours of video recordings Harrison had made over the past 6 months, documenting everything he'd discovered about his family's operation. But these weren't just the anguished confessions of a guilty father. They were detailed testimony meant for law enforcement, complete with dates, locations, financial records, and the names of government officials involved in the conspiracy. Father thought he was being clever, Elizabeth said, scrolling through the video files. He believed he could gather enough evidence to bring us down while protecting himself. What he didn't realize is that we've been monitoring his activities for years. The recordings showed Harrison in his private study, speaking directly to the camera with the intensity of a man unburdening his soul. In one video, he detailed his discovery of the basement laboratory. In another, he explained the financial networks that funded their operations. Most damning of all, he named specific politicians and military officials who had protected and profited from the Blackwood programs. Some of these recordings go back months, I observed. Father's been planning this confession for almost a year, Elizabeth confirmed. We initially thought we could manage his guilt and keep him compliant. But when he hired you, we realized he'd crossed a line we couldn't tolerate. She clicked on a video dated just 3 days ago after Harrison had shown me the medical records at the cafe. In this recording, Harrison looked directly into the camera and said, "If something happens to me, know that Marcus Rivera has all the evidence he needs to expose my family's crimes. I've given him access to everything. He's made you his insurance. policy, Elizabeth said, which is why we need to make you an offer you can't refuse. But what Elizabeth didn't know was that Harrison had been smarter than she realized. Hidden among his confession videos was something that made my heart race with hope. Proof that he'd already contacted federal authorities. The video showed Harrison meeting with FBI agent Sarah Chun at a coffee shop in San Francisco. The timestamp was from 2 weeks ago, before he'd even hired me. He was handing her a flash drive and what appeared to be a written statement. "Your father's already talked to the FBI," I said. Elizabeth's confidence faltered for the first time. "Impossible. We monitor all his communications." "Not all of them, apparently." She frantically clicked through more video files, and her face went pale as she found additional recordings of Harrison meeting with Agent Chun, providing detailed testimony about his family's crimes. The final video showed him handing over a second flash drive containing what he called the complete archive. "That senile fool," Elizabeth muttered, her composure finally cracking. "He's destroyed everything." But then she regained her control, and when she looked at me again, her eyes held a different kind of calculation. "It doesn't matter. Agent Chang can't move on this alone. She need corroborating evidence and witnesses. And if both you and father suffer unfortunate accidents, her investigation will stall. The FBI doesn't work that way, Elizabeth. You'd be surprised how easily investigations can be redirected when the right people apply pressure," she replied. "We've been managing law enforcement interests for decades, a few well-placed phone calls, some classified briefings about national security implications, and Agent Chun will find herself reassigned to tax fraud cases." She accessed another file that showed the extent of their government protection. Names, photographs, and detailed profiles of officials across multiple agencies who were either graduates of their program or willing collaborators who'd been bought or blackmailed into compliance. The list was staggering. Federal judges, congressional representatives, military commanders, intelligence directors. Some had undergone conditioning as children and now served the Blackwood agenda without even knowing it. Others were conscious collaborators who'd been compromised through various means. "This is why we're not worried about your friend Agent Chun," Elizabeth explained. "Her supervisor, Deputy Director Williams, completed our program in 1987. He was one of our most successful early subjects." The implications hit me like a physical blow. If the FBI's own leadership had been compromised, then Harrison's confession might not just be ineffective, it might actually be used against him. "But there's still time to prevent all this unpleasantness," Elizabeth continued. "Father doesn't have to die if you're willing to help us manage the situation. Agent Chin's investigation can be quietly buried, and everyone can go back to their normal lives." "What exactly are you proposing? Help us convince Father to retract his confession. Tell him you've discovered that his information was inaccurate, that his children aren't the monsters he believes them to be. In exchange, we'll provide you with more money than you could earn in 10 lifetimes, and access to resources that will make you one of the most powerful private investigators in the world." She was offering me a choice between justice and survival, between doing what was right and doing what would keep me alive. And from the confidence in her voice, I could tell she'd made this same offer to others before, and they'd accepted it. But what Elizabeth didn't realize was that her father had been even more thorough than she knew. Those confession videos weren't just testimony, they were a dead man's switch. And I was about to discover just how far Harrison's planning had extended. Elizabeth was still waiting for my answer when her phone buzzed with an urgent message. As she read it, her face went from confident to concerned to outright alarmed. She quickly typed a response, then looked at me with a new kind of calculation. In her eyes, "It seems we have a complication," she said. "My brothers are requesting an emergency family meeting. Apparently, Father's behavior tonight has been concerning." "What kind of behavior?" "He's been making phone calls, encrypted ones." She stood up and moved toward a communications console. "But tonight he's been using channels we weren't aware he had access to." The console displayed a real-time surveillance feed from Harrison's study. I could see him at his desk talking animatedly into what appeared to be a satellite phone. The timestamp showed this was happening right now while I was trapped in his children's basement laboratory. Father's not just confessing anymore, Elizabeth muttered, adjusting the audio. Feed. He's coordinating something. Through the crackling speakers, I could hear fragments of Harrison's conversation. Assets are in position. Confirm the timeline. Make sure the children are safe first. The audio cut out as he moved away. From the microphone's range, Elizabeth's phone buzzed again, this time with a message that made her swear under her breath. Victoria and Marcus are en route. They want to accelerate our timeline. Your father's assassination, you mean? His retirement, she corrected automatically, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. But yes, it appears we may need to implement that plan sooner than expected. She pulled up another screen showing encrypted communications between her siblings. The messages were brief but clear. Father knows about tonight's operation. Implement contingency 7 immediately. No witnesses. What's tonight's operation? I asked. Elizabeth hesitated, clearly debating how much to reveal. Finally, she said, we have 8 subjects ready for transport to various clients. The logistics are complex, different destinations, different conditioning requirements. Father wasn't supposed to know about the timing. The screen showed a detailed transportation schedule. Children would be moved from the Blackwood facility to locations across 3 continents over the next 12 hours. Maria Santos was scheduled for delivery to a military contractor in Virginia. 2 other children were headed to a private research facility in Switzerland. The youngest, a 7-year-old boy named Ahmed, was being sent to what the documents euphemistically called a private client in Dubai. You're selling them tonight. We're fulfilling contractual obligations, Elizabeth said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. These arrangements were made months ago. The timing is unfortunate, but our clients' schedules are inflexible. As I watched the surveillance feed of Harrison, I began to understand what was really happening. His phone calls weren't just confessions or coordination, they were countdown sequences. He was implementing some kind of plan that his children didn't fully understand. Elizabeth, I think your father has been planning something bigger than you realize. What do you mean? Before I could answer, the lights in the basement flickered. A moment later, an alarm began sounding throughout the facility, not the kind of security alarm that would indicate a break-in, but an emergency evacuation signal. Elizabeth rushed to her communications console and began typing frantically. The transport vehicles are being redirected, she said, her voice rising in panic. Someone's overriding our security protocols. The surveillance feed from Harrison's study showed him still on his satellite phone, but now he was looking directly at the camera and smiling. He raised his hand in what might have been a wave or a goodbye. He's not just confessing, I realized. He's been working with law enforcement to coordinate a raid. Impossible. We would have detected any federal surveillance. Not if they've been planning this for months. Not if Harrison's been feeding them intelligence the entire time. Elizabeth's phone exploded with incoming messages from her brothers, each more frantic than the last. The transportation schedule was collapsing in real time. Vehicles were being stopped at checkpoints that shouldn't have existed. Facilities in other cities were reporting unexpected visits from federal agents. Father couldn't have orchestrated this alone, Elizabeth said, but I could see doubt creeping into her voice. Maybe not, but Agent Chun could have. With Harrison's evidence and testimony, they've had time to build cases across multiple jurisdictions. The alarm continued blaring, and through the basement's reinforced walls, I could hear the distant sound of vehicles arriving at the estate. Heavy vehicles with diesel engines, the kind used by federal tactical teams. Elizabeth stared at her screens as her family's empire began collapsing around her. Transportation routes were being intercepted, financial accounts were being frozen, and communication networks were going dark one by one. 3 generations of work, she whispered. 70 years of advancement in human development, gone because a senile old man developed a conscience. Elizabeth, it's over. The children upstairs, they need medical attention. If you cooperate, now, maybe you can— There is no cooperation, she snapped, her composure finally breaking completely. Do you understand what you've destroyed? We weren't just running experiments, we were advancing human evolution. The subjects we've created have capabilities that could benefit all of humanity. The surveillance feed showed Harrison standing up from his desk and walking toward his study door. But before he reached it, he suddenly clutched his chest and staggered. He managed to reach for his phone before collapsing to the floor. "Heart attack," Elizabeth said with satisfaction. "Just as we planned. Even if his raid succeeds, Father won't be alive to testify." But as I watched Harrison fall, I noticed something Elizabeth had missed. Before collapsing, he'd managed to press a button on his desk, a button that wasn't part of the standard office equipment. "What does that button do?" I asked. Elizabeth looked at the screen and her face went pale. "Emergency lockdown. It seals the entire facility and activates the evidence preservation protocol." Evidence preservation? Everything is automatically uploaded to multiple secure servers. All files, all video recordings, all communications. Father just sent 70 years of documentation to law enforcement agencies around the world. The basement's heavy steel doors were sliding shut with a mechanical whine that sounded like a death knell. We were trapped, but more importantly so was all the evidence of the Blackwood family's crimes. And somewhere above us, federal agents were about to discover a basement full of tortured children and the most comprehensive documentation of human trafficking and experimentation in modern history. The sound of cutting equipment echoed through the basement as federal agents worked to breach the emergency lockdown. But while Elizabeth and I waited for our inevitable capture, she led me to one final revelation that made everything else pale. In comparison, the live monitoring system that showed current victims in real time. "Since we have a few minutes before our guests arrive," Elizabeth said with bitter resignation, "let me show you what your investigation is actually going to save." She activated a wall of monitors I hadn't noticed before, each displaying a different location. But these weren't the basement rooms I'd seen earlier. These were live feeds from facilities around the world, all showing children in various stages of conditioning and experimentation. "The beauty of our current system," Elizabeth explained, "is that no single location holds more than a few subjects. If one facility is compromised, the others continue operating." The monitors showed horrors that will haunt me for the rest of my life. In one feed, I watched a boy who couldn't have been older than 10 being subjected to sensory deprivation while technicians monitored his brain activity. In another, a teenage girl was strapped to a table while masked figures performed some kind of surgical procedure on her skull. But it was the third monitor that made me understand the immediate urgency of what Harrison had set in motion. The feed showed a transport vehicle, one of the ones that should have been moving children to clients tonight, stopped at what was clearly a law enforcement checkpoint. "That's the van carrying Maria Santos," Elizabeth said, and for the first time her voice carried something that might have been regret. "She was supposed to be delivered to our client in Virginia tonight." Through the grainy footage, I could see federal agents opening the back of the van and finding 3 children. Inside, all heavily sedated and restrained. One of the agents was speaking rapidly into a radio while another began checking the children's vital signs. "They're alive," I said. "For now," Elizabeth replied. "But Maria has been through 6 months of intensive conditioning. Even if you're friends, save her body, I'm not sure they can save her mind." The access codes Harrison had provided me earlier suddenly made more sense. He hadn't just wanted me to discover his family's crimes, he'd wanted me to be able to access the live monitoring system so I could guide rescue operations to current victims. "How many facilities are there currently operating?" I asked. Elizabeth pulled up a global map showing 17 active locations across 6 countries. Each facility housed between 3 and 8 children, all in various stages of what she continued to call enhancement programs. "The subjects you're seeing represent the largest active conditioning program in our family's history," she said. "We had orders for over 60 enhanced operatives from clients in government, military, and private sectors." I memorized the locations as quickly as I could, knowing that this information would be crucial for law enforcement efforts. But what struck me most was how clinical the operation had become. Each child was reduced to a case number, a set of specifications, and a delivery timeline. "Facility 7 in Romania," I said, pointing to one of the feeds. "How many children are there?" 5 currently, but that facility specializes in what we call deep conditioning, complete personality reconstruction, The subjects there have been in program for over a year. The monitor showed children who move like robots, their faces completely blank as they performed simple tasks under the supervision of masked technicians. These weren't just tortured children, they were children who had been psychologically erased and rebuilt as human machines. Jesus Christ, Elizabeth. Do you understand what you've done to these kids? We've given them purpose, she replied, but her voice lacked conviction. They'll never have to struggle with the uncertainties and failures that plague normal humans. They know exactly what they're supposed to do and how to do it perfectly. You've turned them into slaves. We've turned them into the next stage of human evolution. The cutting sounds from above grew louder, and I could hear voices shouting orders. The federal agents were getting closer to breaching the basement, which meant time was running out for both capturing Elizabeth and saving the children in the other facilities. Elizabeth, you need to give me the access codes for the other facilities. If you cooperate now, maybe I'm not cooperating with anything, she said firmly. But I will give you something that might help those children. She pulled up one more file that showed detailed medical information for each current subject. Psychological profiles, conditioning protocols, medication regimens, and most importantly, potential reversal procedures. Not all conditioning is permanent, she explained. Subjects who have been in program for less than 6 months might be recoverable with proper treatment. The files contain everything your medical teams would need to know. The information was staggering in its detail. Each child's file included not just what had been done to them, but also what could potentially be undone. Brain scans showing which neural pathways had been modified, drug protocols that could be reversed, even surgical procedures that could be corrected. Why are you showing me this? Because despite what you think of me, I'm not a monster, Elizabeth said quietly. These children were resources to me, but they're still human beings. If our work is going to be destroyed anyway, at least the subjects might have a chance at recovery. The access codes she gave me weren't just for monitoring, they were administrative. Codes that would allow medical personnel to access the full conditioning protocols and reversal procedures. With this information, the children might actually be saved, not just rescued. The youngest subjects have the best chance, she continued. Their brains are more plastic, more capable of recovering from trauma. But the older ones especially, those who've completed full conditioning, she shook her head. The sound of metal being cut through finally stopped, and I could hear footsteps on the basement stairs. Federal agents were about to discover the most comprehensive evidence of human trafficking and experimentation in modern history. Mr. Rivera, Elizabeth said as the first agent appeared at the bottom of the stairs, I hope you understand that. What we did here was never about cruelty. We genuinely believed we were advancing human potential. The road to hell, I replied, is paved with good intentions, she finished. Yes, I'm familiar with the saying. As the agents moved in to arrest Elizabeth, she handed me a final flash drive. Emergency shutdown protocols for all active facilities, she said. Use them wisely. The drive contained something even more valuable than shutdown codes. It contained the trigger phrases and counter-programming. Sequences that could potentially free the graduates who were already active in the field. Not just the children who could be rescued, but the adults who had been living their entire lives under Blackwood conditioning without even knowing it. Looking at that flash drive, I realized that Harrison's plan had been even more comprehensive than I'd understood. He hadn't just exposed his family's crimes, he'd provided the tools necessary to undo 70 years of human experimentation and conditioning. The question now was whether the world was ready to face the truth about how many of its leaders and heroes had been shaped by the twisted vision of a Nazi scientist and his descendants. The rescue operation that followed was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. Within hours of the basement breach, federal agents were coordinating simultaneous raids across 3 continents. But the most crucial part of the mission wasn't capturing the perpetrators, it was saving the children who were still alive and conscious enough to be saved. I found myself in the surreal position of working alongside the FBI's Child Exploitation Task Force, using Elizabeth's access codes and medical protocols to guide rescue teams through the most complex extraction operation in the Bureau's history. The facility layout maps that Elizabeth had reluctantly provided became our roadmap to salvation. Facility 12 in Cambodia just confirmed rescue of 4 subjects, Agent Sarah Chun reported over the secure radio. But they're going to need extensive medical support. The conditioning appears to be more advanced than we expected. Agent Chun had arrived at the estate within an hour of the basement breach, and she'd immediately recognized the significance of what Harrison had uncovered. More importantly, she understood that time was critical. Every hour we delayed meant more children could be moved, killed, or subjected to irreversible conditioning. The facility maps Elizabeth had shown me were proving to be accurate but incomplete. Each location had hidden areas, backup systems, and emergency protocols designed to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses if the operation was compromised. We were racing against automatic systems that had been programmed to activate if contact with the central command was lost for more than 6 hours. Team 7 reports they've found the main conditioning center in Romania, Agent Chun continued. 5 children recovered, but 3 are in critical condition. They're requesting immediate medical evacuation. I studied the medical protocols Elizabeth had provided, trying to understand which treatments were reversible and which had caused permanent damage. The files were clinical in their precision, documenting exactly what had been done to each child and what the long-term effects would be. The subjects in Romania have been undergoing what they call neural restructuring, I explained to the medical team over the radio. According to these protocols, they've had electrodes implanted in their hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. The good news is that the brain modifications are designed to be adjustable. They might be reversible if we act quickly. The escape route maps that a former victim had drawn and left hidden in the basement proved to be the most valuable intelligence we had. The maps showed ventilation shafts, service tunnels, and hidden passages that the Blackwoods used to move subjects between facilities without detection. But more importantly, they showed where children were likely to be hidden if a facility went into lockdown mode. Facility 9 in Virginia is reporting they found a hidden sublevel, came another radio report. The maps were accurate there. Are 3 more children in what appears to be a medical recovery area. The former victim who had drawn those maps had been extraordinarily brave. According to a note found with the drawings, she had escaped from a Blackwood facility in 2019 but had spent years documenting the layout and security systems, waiting for an opportunity to help other victims. Her intelligence was saving lives. In real time, I was coordinating between rescue teams when Agent Chun pulled me aside with news that made my heart race with both hope and terror. "We found Maria Santos," she said. "She's alive, but barely conscious. The medical team says she's been heavily sedated and shows signs of recent surgical intervention." "Where was she?" The transport van we intercepted was just the decoy. The real Maria was being held at a medical facility in Nevada that wasn't on any of our maps. Apparently, the Blackwoods had backup locations that even Elizabeth didn't know about. This revelation meant there could be other children being held at facilities we hadn't identified. The Blackwood operation was even more complex and compartmentalized. Then we'd realized, "How did you find her?" "Emergency beacon," Agent Chun explained. Harrison had somehow managed to plant tracking devices on some of the children before his death. Maria's beacon activated when the central system went into emergency mode. The tracking devices were Harrison's final gift to the children his family had destroyed. According to the technical specifications we found, he'd been secretly implanting microscopic GPS transmitters during routine medical examinations, disguising them as standard medical procedures. The beacons were designed to activate only if the main Blackwood communication network went down. How many children had beacons implanted? We're not sure yet, but the system is showing 17 active signals worldwide. 17 children who could be tracked and rescued because a guilt-ridden father had found a way to secretly protect them from his own family. It was perhaps the only truly heroic thing Harrison Blackwood had ever done. The rescue teams were working with unprecedented coordination, but each facility presented unique challenges. The Swiss location required a delicate extraction because the children were hooked up to life support systems that couldn't be safely disconnected without medical supervision. The facility in Dubai was booby-trapped with explosives that could have killed everyone inside if not disarmed properly. Facility 15 in Mexico just went dark, Agent Chun reported grimly. No response from the rescue team, and all communications have been cut. The self-destruct protocols, I realized. Elizabeth mentioned that some facilities had automatic systems that would activate if they lost contact with Central Command. We had been working against time all along, but now that time was running out. The Blackwood facilities were designed to eliminate evidence and witnesses if the operation was ever discovered. We weren't just rescuing children, we were racing against machines programmed to commit murder. How long do we have? Unknown. Elizabeth isn't cooperating anymore, and the technical manuals we found don't include specific time frames. I looked at the escape route maps again, this time focusing on the emergency evacuation procedures the former victim had documented. There, in small handwriting at the bottom of one page, was a note that made my blood run cold. Facility lockdown. Activates final protocols after 8 hours of lost contact. Get them out fast. We had been working for 6 hours. In 2 hours, automatic systems would begin executing the final solution that Edmund Blackwood had designed decades ago. If the operation was ever compromised, every piece of evidence would be destroyed, including any witnesses who might testify about what they'd experienced. Agent Chun, we need to warn all the teams. They have 2 hours to extract everyone and get clear of the facilities. 2 hours to save 17 children scattered across 6 countries, some of whom are too damaged to be moved safely. Looking at those facility maps marked with the locations of children who had suffered unimaginable horrors, I realized that Harrison's confession had triggered not just a rescue operation, but a desperate race against time to prevent a final massacre, designed by a Nazi scientist who had planned for this possibility 70 years ago. With less than 2 hours remaining before the automatic destruction protocols activated, Agent Chun made a decision that would determine whether we saved lives or witnessed a massacre. She ordered me to interrogate Elizabeth one final time, not for a confession, but for the specific technical information needed to disable the self-destruct systems. Elizabeth had been transferred to a secure holding facility, but she wasn't talking. She sat in the interrogation room with the same cold composure she'd shown in the basement, as if the collapse of her family's empire was merely an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. 17 children are going to die in 90 minutes, I told her. Whatever you think about your family's work, those kids are innocent. Innocent? Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. They're subjects who have been conditioned for specific purposes. Their previous identities were essentially erased months ago. In many ways, they're already dead. That's not your decision to make. It's not yours either, she replied. But if you're so concerned about their welfare, perhaps you should ask yourself why you're willing to condemn them to lives of psychological trauma and institutional care when they could simply transition peacefully. The clinical way she discussed murdering children was somehow more disturbing than outright violence would have been. Elizabeth genuinely believed that killing these kids would be a mercy compared to the difficulties they would face trying to recover from their conditioning. But then Agent Chun entered the room carrying a folder that changed everything. Inside were documents we'd found in Harrison's private safe, his real will, not the fake version his children had been expecting. Your father left something interesting, Agent Chun said, placing the will on the table. He not only disinherited all 3 of his children, but he left detailed instructions for something he called redemption protocols. Elizabeth's composure cracked for the first time. Impossible. Father didn't have access to the technical systems. He had access to everything, I said, understanding what Harrison had really been doing during his months of supposed confusion and paranoia. He wasn't just gathering evidence, he was learning your systems well enough to build countermeasures. The true will was a masterpiece of long-term planning. Harrison had not only documented his family's crimes, but had also spent months secretly developing ways to undo the damage. The document established a foundation dedicated to helping victims of human trafficking and experimentation, funded by the entire Blackwood fortune, but more importantly, the will included technical specifications for disabling the destruction. Protocols information Harrison had obtained by secretly monitoring his children's activities and copying their security codes. Section 12, subsection C, Agent Chun read aloud. Emergency shutdown procedures for all Blackwood facilities, including override codes for automated security systems. Elizabeth stared at the document as if it were a ghost. He couldn't have known about the technical specifications. We change those codes monthly. He knew because someone was helping him, I realized. Someone with access to your systems who had been feeding him information for months. The truth was revealed in Harrison's final video recording, which Agent Chun had brought with her. In the recording, Harrison explained that Dr. Werner Hoffman, the physician who had signed all those death certificates in the 1960s and 1970s, had not died as the records indicated. He had lived until 2019, and in his final years, he had been secretly working to document and undermine the Blackwood operation. Dr. Hoffman spent 40 years keeping detailed records of every procedure, every victim, every modification, Harrison said in the recording. When he contacted me in 2018, I realized that someone who had been complicit in these crimes his entire life was finally ready to help stop them. Hoffman had been the inside source, using his continued access to medical facilities and his knowledge of the conditioning protocols to gather intelligence. When he died, he left Harrison not just evidence of crimes, but detailed technical manuals for reversing the damage that had been done. The redemption protocols aren't just shutdown codes, I said, reading through Harrison's will. They're deprogramming sequences designed to help victims recover their original personalities. Elizabeth finally broke. Hoffman was a senile old man who never understood the scope of what we were accomplishing. His guilt made him forget that our work was advancing human potential. His guilt made him remember that you were torturing children. Agent Chun corrected. The override codes in Harrison's will worked exactly as promised. Within minutes of transmitting them to the rescue teams, we began receiving confirmations that the automatic destruction systems had been disabled. Facilities that had been locked down were now accessible, and the countdown to mass murder had been stopped. Facility 7 in Romania confirmed shutdown successful, came the radio report. All subjects are stable and ready for evacuation. Facility 12 in Cambodia reports the same. Medical teams are moving in now. One by one, the facilities went quiet as their automated systems were disabled and their human operators were taken into custody. But the real victory came when the medical teams began reporting on the condition of the rescued children. Maria Santos is conscious and responsive, Agent Chun announced. Medical evaluation suggests that while she's been subjected to significant trauma, the conditioning protocols were incomplete. She may have a good chance of recovery. The deprogramming protocols Harrison and Dr. Hoffman had developed were already being implemented by medical teams around the world. The procedures were complex and would take months or years to complete, but for the first time, there was hope that some of the victims could actually recover their original personalities and memories. How many children were rescued total? I asked. 17 confirmed rescues, with 8 more possible victims identified through secondary intelligence, Agent Chun replied. But Marcus, this is just the beginning. The network Harrison exposed includes hundreds of compromised officials and thousands of graduates who don't even know they've been conditioned. Elizabeth looked up from the will with an expression I couldn't quite read. You have no idea what you've unleashed, she said quietly. Some of those graduates hold positions where their conditioning makes them dangerous if it's disrupted incorrectly. What do you mean? Military commanders, intelligence officers, nuclear facility supervisors, people whose psychological conditioning includes fail-safes that could be triggered if deprogramming is attempted without proper protocols. She was telling us that some of the victims Harrison had tried to save might actually pose threats to national security if their conditioning was removed incorrectly. The Blackwood operation had been designed with multiple layers of protection, including the possibility that exposure could cause as much damage as the original crimes. Then you'd better help us figure out how to do it right, Agent Chun said. Firmly, and why would I do that? Agent Chun placed one final document on the table, a photograph of Maria Santos. conscious and smiling weakly at a medical team member who was checking her vital signs. Because, Agent Chun said, it's the only way any of this ends with something other than more dead children. The will reading that Harrison had originally scheduled was transformed into something he never could have imagined. A federal task force briefing attended by representatives from 6 countries, multiple intelligence agencies, and the International Criminal Court. But the document being read wasn't just Harrison's last testament. It was a roadmap for dismantling 70 years of systematic human trafficking and governmental corruption. I sat in the Blackwood Estate's main conference room, which had been converted into a secure command center. Agent Chen was presenting findings to officials whose presence revealed just how far the conspiracy had reached. Assistant Director Williams of the FBI had recused himself when Harrison's database revealed his own conditioning history. 3. Senators had declined to attend when their names appeared on the collaboration lists. The recorded confessions provide detailed testimony about Operation Mindbridge. Agent Chen announced, activating the hidden recording equipment Harrison had installed throughout the house months earlier. Mr. Blackwood's statements corroborate physical evidence found at 17 facilities across 6 countries. The recording equipment had been Harrison's masterstroke. While his children believed they were monitoring him, he had been recording them. Every conversation about transporting children, every discussion of client requirements, every casual reference to conditioning protocols had been captured and automatically transmitted to secure servers. Victoria's voice filled the room. The Malaysian shipment needs to be delayed. 3 of the subjects aren't responding to psychological conditioning as expected. We may need to implement physical modifications before delivery. Marcus's voice followed. The Pentagon contract specifies enhanced pain tolerance and absolute obedience. If we can't deliver those specifications, they'll find another supplier. Elizabeth's clinical discussions of surgical procedures were perhaps the most damning. Subject 15 requires hippocampus modification to eliminate emotional attachment responses. The procedure has a 94% success rate with acceptable mortality risk. The officials in the room listened in stunned silence as Harrison's children casually discussed torturing children with the detachment of people planning a business meeting. But what truly shocked them was hearing their own names mentioned in connection with the operation. Senator Morrison's office confirmed the order for 6 subjects with enhanced interrogation resistance. Victoria's recorded voice continued. Delivery to the CIA training facility in Virginia is scheduled for next month. Senator Morrison, who was sitting 3 seats away from me, went pale. I never authorized any such thing, he said weakly. According to these records, you've been making similar authorizations for 8 years. Agent Chun replied, consulting Harrison's files. Always through intermediaries, always with plausible deniability. The live recording equipment had captured more than just the Blackwood children's crimes. It had documented the entire support network that made their operation possible. Officials who thought they were discussing legitimate intelligence assets had unknowingly been ordering tortured children. Military commanders who believed they were recruiting enhanced soldiers had been purchasing human beings, but the most devastating recordings were of the children themselves. Harrison's equipment had captured audio from the basement laboratory, including the voices of victims during conditioning sessions. Please stop, came Maria Santos's voice, barely above a whisper. I want to go home. I want my mama. The response was Elizabeth's clinical tone. Home is a psychological construct, subject 12. We're going to help you understand that your purpose is here, serving important people who need your abilities. The room fell completely silent. These weren't abstract discussions of policy or national security. They were recordings of a 12-year-old girl being psychologically destroyed by people who spoke about it like a medical procedure. General Patterson, who had been reviewing his own file from Harrison's database, finally spoke. How many of my personnel are compromised? 43 active duty soldiers and 17 officers in your command have conditioning indicators, Agent Chung replied. We're still determining which ones pose security risks and which ones are simply victims who need treatment. The federal arrest warrants Agent Chien had brought were extensive, over 200 individuals across government, military and private sectors. But the arrests were only the beginning. Each person taken into custody revealed new connections, new facilities, new victims. The immediate priority is securing all remaining subjects and preventing retaliation against potential witnesses. Agent Chun continued. But the long-term challenge is identifying and safely deprogramming hundreds of graduates who are currently serving in sensitive positions. She activated a secure video feed showing the arrest of Victoria and Marcus Blackwood at a private airfield where they'd been attempting to flee the country. Both had been carrying briefcases full of cash and documents that appeared to be new identities. The siblings were also carrying something else, Agent Chun announced. Activation codes for what they called sleeper assets, conditioned individuals, who can be triggered to carry out specific actions on command. The implications were terrifying. The Blackwood operation hadn't just created victims, it had created weapons. People in positions of authority who could be activated to commit acts of sabotage, assassination, or terrorism if the family's operation was ever threatened. "How many sleeper assets are we talking about?" asked Director Harrison from the CIA. Based on the codes Victoria was carrying, at least 50 individuals in high-security positions. Military base commanders, nuclear facility supervisors, air traffic controllers, federal judges, people whose conditioning could cause mass casualties if activated incorrectly. The recording equipment had captured one final revelation that changed how everyone in the room understood the scope of the threat. In a conversation from 3 weeks ago, Elizabeth had discussed what she called the Samson option, a plan to activate all sleeper assets simultaneously. If the family's operation was ever exposed, "If we go down, we take half the government. With us," Elizabeth's recorded voice explained, 50 years of carefully placed assets all activated at once would cause enough chaos to destroy any investigation. "The good news," Agent Chun continued, "is that Harrison's technical team has identified the activation frequencies and developed counter-programming that should neutralize the sleeper conditioning safely. But as I listened to those recordings, I realized something that made my blood run cold. Elizabeth had been carrying activation codes, but she'd been captured before she could use them. Someone else might have backup codes, and they might decide that triggering the Samson option was preferable to facing justice. "Agent Chun," I said, "we need to find out if there are other family members or collaborators who have access to those activation codes." "Why?" "Because if someone decides to activate those sleeper assets, we're not just looking at individual crimes anymore. We're looking at a coordinated attack on critical infrastructure by people who have been trained to cause maximum damage." The recording equipment had saved the children and exposed the conspiracy, but it had also revealed that the true threat might just be beginning. The federal arrest warrants Agent Chin had prepared were executed with military precision across multiple time zones. I watched from the command center as teams moved simultaneously against targets in Washington, New York, Los Angeles, and international locations. But what we discovered in the first wave of arrests confirmed my worst fears about the activation codes. "Senator Walsh isn't responding to arrest attempts," Agent Chun reported grimly. Her security detail claims she left for an undisclosed location 3 hours ago, right around the time Victoria and Marcus were taken into custody. Senator Walsh, the Intelligence Committee chair whose corruption Harrison's files had exposed, was also one of the few people outside the immediate family who had been given backup activation codes. If she was running, it meant she might be planning to use them. The arrest warrants had been based on evidence from Harrison's database, but each arrest revealed new layers of the conspiracy. Deputy Director Williams had been taken into custody, but his interrogation revealed that he genuinely didn't remember his conditioning. He had been making decisions that protected the Blackwood operation for years without consciously knowing why. "This is what's so insidious about their system," Dr. Rebecca Martinez explained to the task force. She was the lead psychologist brought in to evaluate the conditioning victims. "The subjects aren't just programmed to obey, they're programmed to believe their actions are their own choices." The federal documents authorizing the arrests included psychological profiles for each target, developed from Harrison's files and Dr. Hoffman's research. Some officials had been conscious collaborators, fully aware of what they were supporting. Others had been conditioned as children and were unknowingly serving the Blackwood agenda. Still, others had been blackmailed or coerced into compliance. General Kane falls into the third category, Dr. Martinez continued, consulting her files. He was a conscious collaborator who believed he was supporting legitimate military research. His psychological profile suggests genuine shock at discovering the true nature of the operation. But the most troubling cases were the unconscious assets. People who had been conditioned so thoroughly that they couldn't distinguish between their programming and their authentic thoughts. These individuals posed the greatest security risk, because they could be activated without even realizing what was happening to them. How do we identify someone who's been conditioned if they don't know it themselves? Asked Director Harrison. Trigger phrases, response patterns, behavioral analysis, Dr. Martinez replied. Harrison and Dr. Hoffman documented the specific conditioning protocols used on different generations of subjects. We can test for those patterns. The arrest operations were revealing the true scope of the Blackwood network, but they were also creating a new problem. Each person taken into custody represented a potential security breach, a possible sleeper asset, or a witness who might not survive long enough to testify. Judge Patricia Reynolds was found dead in her chambers an hour ago, Agent Chun announced to the room. Apparent suicide, but the timing is suspicious. Judge Reynolds had been one of the officials Harrison's files identified as compromised. Her death meant we'd lost both a potential witness and evidence of how the Blackwood operation had influenced federal court decisions for decades. That's the third suspicious death since the arrests began, Agent Chun continued. We're dealing with people who would rather die than face exposure, or with elimination protocols that activate when subjects are compromised. The thought that some of the conditioning might include suicide programming was horrifying but logical. If the Blackwood operation had been sophisticated enough to create sleeper assets, they would certainly have included fail-safes to prevent those assets from being turned against them. But then we received news that changed everything. Senator Walsh had been located, and she wasn't running, she was implementing the Samson option. NSA intercepted communications from a secure facility in Montana, Agent Chun reported. Walsh is transmitting activation codes on multiple frequencies. We have approximately 40 minutes before the signals reach all intended targets. The facility in Montana wasn't on any of Harrison's maps. It was a backup command center that the Blackwood operation had maintained for exactly this scenario, a place where activation codes could be transmitted if the main operation was compromised. How many assets are we talking about? I asked. 53. Confirmed targets, including military base commanders, nuclear facility supervisors, air traffic control supervisors, and federal judges, Agent Chun replied. If they're all activated simultaneously, we're looking at potential attacks on critical infrastructure across the country. The activation codes weren't just psychological triggers, they were instructions for specific actions. According to the documents Victoria had been carrying, each sleeper asset had been programmed with detailed operational plans that would activate along with their conditioning. Base Commander Johnson at Fort Bragg is programmed to initiate lockdown protocols. And weapons dispersal, Agent Chen read from the files. Judge Martinez in the Ninth Circuit is conditioned to issue emergency rulings that would paralyze federal law enforcement. Air Traffic Supervisor Williams at LAX has instructions to ground all flights and create maximum transportation chaos. Individually, these actions would be disruptive. Simultaneously, they would create a cascade of failures that could cripple government response to any crisis. Do we have counterprogramming for these specific assets? Dr. Martinez asked. Some, Agent Chun replied. Harrison's files include deprogramming protocols for 41 of the 53 targets. But we need to reach them before the activation signals trigger their conditioning. The counterprogramming had to be delivered personally, using specific phrases and behavioral cues that would override the Blackwood conditioning. It couldn't be done over radio or telephone. Trained personnel had to be physically present with each target. We have 37 minutes to deploy teams to 53 locations across the country, Agent Chun announced. This is the largest coordinated psychological intervention in history. I looked at the federal warrants spread across the table and realized that everything we'd accomplished rescuing the children, exposing the conspiracy, Arresting the collaborators would be meaningless if we couldn't prevent the Samson option from succeeding. Agent Chun, I said, I need to get to Montana. If Walsh is coordinating this from there, maybe I can stop the transmissions at the source. That facility is designed to be impregnable. Even if you could get inside, Walsh has probably booby-trapped the whole operation. Then we'd better hope Harrison's planning was as thorough as everything else he did. Because somewhere in those federal documents was the key to stopping a coordinated attack by people who had been programmed to destroy the very system they'd spent their lives serving. The congressional investigation that followed was unlike anything in American history. What had started as a private investigation into one family's crimes had become a systematic examination of how democratic institutions could be compromised from within. I found myself testifying before a special committee that included members of Congress, military officials, and international observers, many of whom were learning for the first time that their own colleagues had been compromised. The congressional investigation documents I helped prepare revealed the true scope of what Harrison had uncovered. The Blackwood operation hadn't just been trafficking children or creating individual victims, it had been systematically infiltrating and corrupting the foundations of government itself. Mr. Rivera, Committee Chair Senator Davis asked during my testimony, in your professional opinion, how long would it have taken to identify this network without Mr. Blackwood's cooperation? Decades, if ever, I replied honestly. The operation was designed to be invisible. Victims either died, were conditioned to forget their experiences, or were placed in positions where exposing the truth would destroy their own careers. The investigation had already led to the resignation of 43 federal officials, the court-martial of 17 military officers, and criminal charges against over 200 individuals. But what truly shocked the committee was learning how many legitimate policy decisions had been influenced by people who were unknowingly serving a Nazi agenda. The voting patterns Senator Walsh provided on intelligence oversight, I continued, all served to protect operations connected to the Blackwood network. She genuinely believed she was making patriotic decisions, but her conditioning ensured those decisions aligned with her programmer's goals. The committee had access to all of Harrison's files, but the most damning evidence came from the psychological evaluations of conditioned officials. Dr. Martinez had developed techniques for identifying conditioning patterns, and the results were disturbing. Nearly 15% of senior government personnel showed some form of psychological manipulation. Not all conditioning was related to the Blackwood operation, Dr. Martinez explained to the committee. We've identified at least 3 other family networks that were running similar programs. The Blackwoods were just the most sophisticated. The revelation that there were other operations had transformed the investigation from a criminal case into a national security crisis. If one family could compromise this many officials, how many other networks were operating that hadn't been discovered? Senator Davis consulted the investigation documents before asking his next question. Dr. Martinez, what can you tell us about the deprogramming efforts? We've had mixed success, she replied. Subjects who were conditioned as adults can usually be helped to recognize their programming and develop coping strategies. But those who were conditioned as children, their personalities were fundamentally altered. Recovery is possible, but it's a lifelong process. The Congressional Committee had established a special fund for victim support, using assets seized from the Blackwood network. But the psychological damage couldn't be undone with money. Children like Maria Santos would need years of specialized treatment, and even then, some aspects of their conditioning might never be fully reversed. The international implications are equally serious, testified Ambassador Wilson from the State Department. We've identified Blackwood graduates in government positions in 14 countries. Some were placed there deliberately as intelligence assets. Others emigrated naturally and rose through their adopted countries. Systems while unknowingly serving American interests. The scope was staggering. For 70 years, the Blackwood operation had been placing programmed individuals throughout global power structures. Some had become business leaders, others had joined military forces, and many had entered government service. Their conditioning ensured they would make decisions that served American interests, even when those decisions contradicted their own country's needs. "Are we talking about a shadow government?" Senator Martinez asked. "We're talking about something worse," I replied. "A shadow government would at least have conscious leadership and clear objectives. This was unconscious manipulation of democratic processes by people who didn't even know they were being controlled." The committee's final report, based on the congressional investigation documents, would run to over 3,000 pages. But the executive summary was devastating in its simplicity. American democracy had been compromised by a systematic program of human trafficking and psychological conditioning that had operated for 7 decades with the knowledge and support of officials at the highest levels of government. "The most disturbing aspect," the report concluded, "is not that this operation existed, but that it could exist for so long without detection. The compartmentalization and institutional protection suggest vulnerabilities in our democratic systems that extend far beyond this single case." The international response was swift and harsh. Allied countries began conducting their own investigations into whether their officials had been compromised. Trade agreements were suspended pending security reviews. Intelligence sharing arrangements were frozen until the full scope of American infiltration could be determined. "We estimate it will take 5 to 10 years to fully understand the impact on international relations," Ambassador Wilson told the committee. "Some of our closest allies are questioning whether they can trust any American official who has held high-level positions in the past 30 years. But perhaps the most important outcome of the congressional investigation was the establishment of new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent similar operations. Mandatory psychological screening for high-security positions, regular background reinvestigations, and most importantly, protected channels for reporting suspected conditioning or manipulation. The Harrison Blackwood Foundation, I explained to the committee, has been established not just to help victims, but to research and develop countermeasures against psychological conditioning. We can't prevent future operations, but we can make them much harder to sustain. The foundation, funded by the seized Blackwood assets, represented Harrison's true legacy. Not the fortune built on suffering, but an organization dedicated to protecting future generations from the kind of systematic abuse his family had perfected. As I finished my testimony, Senator Davis asked one final question. "Mr. Rivera, what do you think would have happened if Harrison Blackwood had never contacted you?" I thought about Maria Santos slowly recovering in a specialized facility, about the 17 children who had been rescued from ongoing conditioning, about the hundreds of officials who had been freed from programming they didn't even know existed. "The operation would still be running," I said simply. "And we'd never have known that our democracy was being controlled by the legacy of a Nazi scientist who died 50 years ago." The congressional investigation had exposed the crime, but it had also revealed just how vulnerable democratic institutions were to systematic psychological manipulation. The real question wasn't whether this could happen again, it was whether we would recognize it if it did. The congressional investigation that followed was unlike anything in American history. What had started as a private investigation into one family's crimes had become a systematic examination of how democratic institutions could be compromised from within. I found myself testifying before a special committee that included members of Congress, military officials, and international observers, many of whom were learning for the first time that their own colleagues had been compromised. The congressional investigation documents I helped prepare revealed the true scope of what Harrison had uncovered. The Blackwood operation hadn't just been trafficking children or creating individual victims, it had been systematically infiltrating and corrupting the foundations of government itself. "Mr. Rivera," Committee Chair Senator Davis asked during my testimony, "in your professional opinion, how long would it have taken to identify this network without Mr. Blackwood's cooperation?" "Decades, if ever," I replied honestly. "The operation was designed to be invisible. Victims either died, were conditioned to forget their experiences, or were placed in positions where exposing the truth would destroy their own careers." The investigation had already led to the resignation of 43 federal officials. the court-martial of 17 military officers, and criminal charges against over 200 individuals. But what truly shocked the committee was learning how many legitimate policy decisions had been influenced by people who were unknowingly serving a Nazi agenda. The voting patterns Senator Walsh provided on intelligence oversight, I continued, all served to protect operations connected to the Blackwood network. She genuinely believed she was making patriotic decisions, but her conditioning ensured those decisions aligned with her programmer's goals. The committee had access to all of Harrison's files, but the most damning evidence came from the psychological evaluations of conditioned officials. Dr. Martinez had developed techniques for identifying conditioning patterns, and the results were disturbing. Nearly 15% of senior government personnel showed some form of psychological manipulation. Not all conditioning was related to the Blackwood operation, Dr. Martinez explained to the committee. We've identified at least 3 other family networks that were running similar programs. The Blackwoods were just the most sophisticated. The revelation that there were other operations had transformed the investigation from a criminal case into a national security crisis. If one family could compromise this many officials, how many other networks were operating that hadn't been discovered? Senator Davis consulted the investigation documents before asking his next question. Dr. Martinez, what can you tell us about the deprogramming efforts? We've had mixed success, she replied. Subjects who were conditioned as adults can usually be helped to recognize their programming and develop coping strategies. But those who were conditioned as children, their personalities were fundamentally altered. Recovery is possible, but it's a lifelong process. The Congressional Committee had established a special fund for victim support, using assets seized from the Blackwood network. But the psychological damage couldn't be undone with money. Children like Maria Santos would need years of specialized treatment, and even then, some aspects of their conditioning might never be fully reversed. The international implications are equally serious, testified Ambassador Wilson from the State Department. We've identified Blackwood graduates in government positions in 14 countries. Some were placed there deliberately as intelligence assets. Others emigrated naturally and rose through their adopted countries' systems while unknowingly serving American interests. The scope was staggering. For 70 years, the Blackwood operation had been placing programmed individuals throughout global power structures. Some had become business leaders, others had joined military forces, and many had entered government service. Their conditioning ensured they would make decisions that served American interests, even when those decisions contradicted their own country's needs. Are we talking about a shadow government? Senator Martinez asked. We're talking about something worse, I replied. A shadow government would at least have conscious leadership and clear objectives. This was unconscious manipulation of democratic processes by people who didn't even know they were being controlled. The committee's final report, based on the congressional investigation documents, would run to over 3,000 pages. But the executive summary was devastating in its simplicity. American democracy had been compromised by a systematic program of human trafficking and psychological conditioning that had operated for 7 decades with the knowledge and support of officials at the highest levels of government. The most disturbing aspect, the report concluded, is not that this operation existed, but that it could exist for so long without detection. The compartmentalization and institutional protection suggest vulnerabilities in our democratic systems that extend far beyond this single case. The international response was swift and harsh. Allied countries began conducting their own investigations into whether their officials had been compromised. Trade agreements were suspended pending security reviews. Intelligence sharing arrangements were frozen until the full scope of American infiltration could be determined. We estimate it will take 5 to 10 years to fully understand the impact on international relations, Ambassador Wilson told the committee. Some of our closest allies are questioning whether they can trust any American official who has held high-level positions in the past 30 years. But perhaps the most important outcome of the congressional investigation was the establishment of new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent similar operations. Mandatory psychological screening for high-security positions, regular background reinvestigations, and most importantly, protected channels for reporting suspected conditioning or manipulation. The Harrison Blackwood Foundation, I explained to the committee, has been established not just to help victims, but to research and develop countermeasures against psychological conditioning. We can't prevent future operations, but we can make them much harder to sustain. The foundation, funded by the seized Blackwood assets, represented Harrison's true legacy. Not the fortune built on suffering, but an organization dedicated to protecting future generations from the kind of systematic abuse his family had perfected. As I finished my testimony, Senator Davis asked one final question. Mr. Rivera, what do you think would have happened if Harrison Blackwood had never contacted you? I thought about Maria Santos slowly recovering in a specialized facility, about the 17 children who had been rescued from ongoing conditioning, about the hundreds of officials who had been freed from programming they didn't even know existed. The operation would still be running, I said simply. And we'd never have known that our democracy was being controlled by the legacy of a Nazi scientist who died 50 years ago. The congressional investigation had exposed the crime, but it had also revealed just how vulnerable democratic institutions were to systematic psychological manipulation. The real question wasn't whether this could happen again, it was whether we would recognize it if it did.